Today's webinar is part of Carla's Social Justice in Language Education Initiative. And as part of this initiative, we've been doing a workshop series on different topics related to social justice in the language classroom. And so actually today's webinar will be followed by a workshop on November 15th. That's something that you can register for on the Carla website. And again, Karen's putting information in the chat about all the things that I'm talking about. This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on Carla's YouTube channel, as well as on the webpage that houses the resources for all of the workshops that we're giving as part of the Social Justice in Language Education Initiative. We are really, really excited to have Françoise Thenoux with us today. You may know Françoise as the woke Spanish teacher on social media. She specializes in anti-bias, anti-racist, and equitable world language curriculum and education. Today, she's joining us from Chile. And the title of her talk is Celebrating Our Differences, Unpacking Identity with a Decolonial Lens in the World Language Classroom. We will leave the chat open. You're welcome to use that for back channeling, and we'll also ask you to put any questions that you have for Françoise in the chat, and we'll ask those at the end of the presentation. Françoise, welcome. I'll hand things over to you.
Hey, everybody. Hello here from Chile. We only have half an hour, so we're going to get started. We're going to get moving on. I'm going to introduce myself in a little bit. So, as Kate said, my webinar is called Celebrating Our Differences and Unpacking Identity Through a Decolonial Lens. I know the title seems a little scary, but I want us to keep in mind that decolonization is a process. This is not a magic recipe that I'm going to give you. I'm going to be very candid about my own process of decolonization. And the first step to this journey is being here. And I appreciate everyone in this session for taking the time to think about these topics and eventually create a ripple effect in their students. So I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm in stolen land in the Aguita Chango territory. I used to live in Philadelphia, which was Lenni Lenape territory. You can do decolonization without first acknowledging the trauma and the wound that it's still open that settler colonialism caused, especially in this side of the world. If you are either in South America, Central America, or in North America, we all have a colonial past and a colonial present and a colonial future. And it's important to recognize, and this is the starting point for what we're going to be talking about. These are our community agreements. I like to work in community agreements here on my webinars, sometimes in the classroom too. I didn't have classroom rules. I had community agreements, which was more aligned with what Indigenous people do in their communities. And since I was decolonizing, even discipline was something that I had to decolonize. So we're going to take time to process the information. We're going to keep the microphones off. What happens in the session stays in the session, especially when people share their stories. I want this to be a space of trust. If you take good notes, share with a larger community. There are some people that make really good, sometimes doodles and like mental maps, and that would be nice if you can share and tag me, and tag also Carla, the University of Minnesota. And I want us to remain open to the sort of information that we're going to be talking about in this webinar. Now, let's do a quick expectations check. So today I will be giving you some tools and takeaways, but this roadmap requires far more than I can provide in 30 minutes. That's why I encourage people to, if they want to go deeper in this topic, to register for the workshop. I have a little picture here, and I want us to think that we already walk some of this road. So right now we are right here. Hopefully next we're going to be over there, and at some point we're going to be on top of the mountain. But since this process is a cycle, is sort of round, we never really get to a point that we say we don't need to decolonize anymore. We are continuously coming undone and rebuilding, you know. This is me, Françoise Thenoux. My pronouns are she in English and ella en español. I'm an educator, an educational facilitator, a writer, a coach, and a consultant. I've been an educator for more than 20 years, no, almost 20 years, more than 20 years. I lived in the United States for 18 years. I had the experience of being a racialized Latina over there and going through the immigration process, which wasn't very kind. I worked as an ESL teacher with immigrant students. I worked for 13 years as a Spanish teacher at an elementary level, and I have a master's degree in early childhood and primary education. So my journey started with redesigning my curriculum from a multicultural perspective, then moving to anti-bias, anti-racist, and then finally embracing decolonization. And I wanted to start right away with thinking about our own identities and intersectionality. So I'm going to share with you some of the things about me. I already told you a little bit about my trauma, what maybe made my life a little harder, being an immigrant, being a Latina immigrant, being a Spanish speaker in the USA. I also, unfortunately, grew up in dictatorship, in a fascist dictatorship in Chile. And all those things are things, when we look in perspective, that they were the barriers that I had growing up and just living my daily life. But also, when we look at our identities intersectionally, even when we are oppressed, we have some privileges. And I wanted to share some of my privileges with you. So I am a light-skinned Latina, and sometimes people might think in the United States that I was white. And I'm talking about the sense of whiteness, like in United States. In Chile, I'm actually considered white. I'm a college-educated person. I'm heterosexual. I'm able-bodied, and I mask really well as a neurotypical person, even though I'm neurodivergent. So these are the things that make my life easier. These are my privileges. And the things that I want us to think about is, how can we leverage those things that make our lives easier, like our privileges, in order to be a person that revitalizes and elevate the voices of those who are not privileged in this area. I have a little magnifying glass there in the word cisgender, and I have my t-shirt that says protect trans kids. And this was one of my one of the reasons, for example, that I started using inclusive language, inclusive Spanish in my classroom, is because I wanted to leverage my privilege as a cisgender person to provide that brave space for my non-binary children in my classroom. If you want that shirt, the non-binary artist that sells that shirt, the information is right there in the corner. Now, I wanted to share, this is something new that I am included in my praxis. I was writing a book chapter, and I came up to a really good, interesting concept that Gloria Anzaldúa coined. And it's called decolonial, I want to pronounce it really well. Decolonial imperative. And it's this idea that as the goddess of the moon in the Aztec tradition, in the Mexica tradition, that is fragmented, we are in a process of fragmenting and putting the pieces together all the time. It's a cycle. Okay, and the process of decolonization is basically very similar to what Gloria Anzaldúa talks about in this imperative. I have a little picture of the goddess here. They found a really beautiful stone in Mexico, and it's this fragmented body, you know, and putting the pieces together. When we are part of a place that was colonized, there are all these fragmented pieces of us that are floating out there, that maybe we have told a story that wasn't true, or we told the story from the point of the colonizer, that we actually need to pull apart in a process of decolonization. Because decolonization, when we want to do decolonization in our praxis, pedagogical praxis, we need to start decolonizing ourselves. And I have a few key concepts here that, for example, help me walk through this journey. And one of them, and I think the most important, is historical reckoning, and finding out the real history through the voices of indigenous people of the place where you lived at. Since we teach languages, it's very important to also do the historical reckoning in about that diaspora that we're teaching about. For example, in my case, I'm a Spanish speaker and I taught Spanish. For me, it was really important to know the indigenous history of these lands and inform myself and how colonization influence had the repercussions that would felt today in our communities, in our Spanish-speaking communities. Another important thing that we need to do when we are decolonizing ourselves and our praxis is indigenization. And this is elevating the voices of indigenous people in our curriculum and make them present, make them relevant, revitalize those stories. One thing that we need to do in this journey that is, like I wrote here, it's a journey that is imperfect, cyclical, and healing. I misspell healing there, and deeply political. It is questioning, questioning what have been taught, what we have learned. Why is it that, for example, in my personal case, most of the streets in Chile are named after colonizers? Why was I taught the history of Christopher Columbus as a hero? And all that questioning would lead me to the answers that would help me in this fragmentation and putting together the pieces in this imperative, in this cycle that Gloria Anzaldúa talks about. And I have in the center the praxis of Paulo Freire. According to Paulo Freire, we need to engage in praxis, which is a cycle of theory, action, and reflection, in order to change ourselves, to transform the world in which we live, that it's inequitable, that is not fair. And one of the things that Paulo Freire points out in this praxis that is so important is horizontality, which means that we in our students are both learners. We are not in a superior position. We are not depositing knowledge in empty vessels. Our students bring their own identity, their own history, their own cultural background. And when we start talking about identity, it is important to set ourselves in the same space as they are. Decentering is something that I'm going to speak about more in depth in a workshop, but it basically means decentering all the colonizers' narratives in order to create a new narrative that is more representative of and accurate of the history. Revitalization, not only revitalize the identities of those in the margins, in the diaspora of the language that we're teaching about, but also our own identity. Bring ourselves authentically to our classrooms. And when we speak about decolonization, about education with the decolonial lens, the first thing that I want us to acknowledge is that colonization is an ongoing process. And I'm going to share with you a video. It's a very short video because I like to bring authentic voices to my webinars. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about these graphs that are here.
Decolonization is less about returning to a pre-colonial society and more about recognizing that we live under a colonial system. That things are the way they are, not by accident, but because a particular ideology has systematically erased others while normalizing itself. Once something is normalized, it's hard to imagine anything else. We become confined within that particular ideology. And then the mindset of, it's always been this way, starts to creep in. And then the origins of the colonizers, which in our case was a very violent one, can be forgotten. We start sweeping things under the rug, and that's why many people are confused by things like the Māori Health Authority and even iwi settlements. And so when we're able to recognize these structures through what will be a never-ending process of decolonization, it helps us move forward towards a society which doesn't just draw inspiration from a diversity of spaces, but is also self-aware, which I think is the most important part.
So important in the process of decolonization. And we have two things that are the inheritance of settler colonialism, and it's the same up north and here south in the territory of Abiala. One thing is there were ontological ideals or cookie cutters of ideals of how a person should be, and this is what it grants us privilege. For example, the preferred race was white, the sexuality heteronormative, the gender cisgender, the religion Christian, and the language English in the north, Spanish in the south, French in some parts of Latin America too. And the model that we follow as a society that elevates this ontological ideal is patriarchal. And you would say that's something from the past. How do we see it nowadays? Well, a lot of these things, a lot of these ontological ideas have mutated maybe and have become something different, but they are still the same. We still have white supremacy, anti-Blackness all around the world. And how do these things kept on existing, you would ask, after supposedly the colonial settlers left this territory? It lived through as epistemologies, which is ideas, knowledge, and beliefs. There were books written about the superiority of some races. In the case of the Spanish Empire, there was a caste system that it's, if you look at the picture of the caste system, you would see that is the same racial division that we have nowadays in Latin American countries. So these legacies, even though settler colonialism, you might think is something from the past, these legacies live through history. They change names right now. Sometimes it's called white supremacy, you know, or what is it, Christian nationalism, but it's basically all, it was basically all born out of that, the ontological ideas, ideals, and the epistemologies. And when we're talking about identity specifically, it's very important to have a lens of intersectionality. And intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which speaks about the way our identities that are multifaceted, that are very complex, in our own identities, there are things that overlap and things that are barriers and things that are privileges. As I described myself in the first slide, you know, I talked a little bit about my barriers and I talked a little bit about my privileges too. What gets me closer to this wheel of power, closer to the power? Now, when it comes to language, as you can see, language is one of the identity markers that we explore in intersectionality. Language is here, and language overlaps with many other identity markers too, as we're going to talk a little bit later on this presentation. But I want you to look at the wheel of power and language. And this refers to North America, where English is the dominant language. We have the English language, the English speakers, closer to power. Then we have the people who have learned English a little bit farther. And then out here in the outsides, in the margins, we have non-English monolingual people. And I want us to think about that in the positionality of, for example, Spanish in North America. I want to ask you a question, and we're going to give you a minute to answer in the chat. And I'm going to show you a beautiful video here, but before I show you the video, I want you to tell me, what is language? What do you think language is? And Kate is going to start reading your answers. Just whatever came to your mind first, I want you to write it.
Okay, so we've got verbal and nonverbal communication. Language is second skin to culture. Anything that helps us communicate and express our thinking. More about culture, community. It's part of our identities, our thoughts. It's a way to connect and share. It's a way to express our feelings, beliefs, and perceptions. Shared linguistic practices in a given community. History, grammar, emotions. It's part of who we are. Those are sort of the unique things that come in. It makes our thinking visible, knowledge.
I really liked all those answers because, and I want us to watch the video first. And this video, it's a beautiful video, guys, and it talks about the disappearances of indigenous languages and what happens when that happens, you know. But I want you to especially pay attention to the indigenous views on language and what language actually means to this particular community.
Kema poliwe setla tol kamanali, no chitlamandi tengi hiektitsi, que hasitalime, tuana te panitsi. Tentichiwa te masewalme, que hakema te kewia, totlamikilis, o tenti machilia pantotlacayo o pantoyolo, ayuele tiquiti. Kema setla tol kamanali poliwi, no chitlenonga panitla te pactli, que hanobawai mano pa atentini, no chitlamandi te kuanime, kuano chitlamandi shugutini. Ni yo nashtimu isguis, ni yo nashuele tiquitos, ni yo nashuele ticachilis, o ticakis, pampa politos mapatoli. Waka motsakwa ipancampa huele chinangotini, ipancampa huele tlatepactli que jaquema motsakwa sepa puerta o se ventana. Quema unca sequino tlatolcamanali, mista chiatis, pampa timachilis tamante en Santo Fe huele pichiwa, guante pichiwa, masehuatlagam. Yani, tatlenquipia yoliste y panitla tepactli. Kema poliwi se tlatolcamanali, no chipoliwi. Hasta no pacamanali te cuya, para ti te esguiste ti te ignelia. O kema ti te pogulia para tlach que te chcocoa o te chcuesua. Poliwi no pa antigua tuica tlemi cayaya tu escapantatawa. Nuchitamante tianki guayaya, fijata mamatuya, que mamotio chihuayaya, que jamos caltique, ayucaca hueli samba lucas, que mapolihuise tlator cananali, eli que jamiki, mamías mi queja, mamías mi quise, eli que que matlapani se tesca, inintos, eli que acahuilo, que en sampanoteji, pampa ayucaca molinía, aunque más pano yani, más igual me mucagua, más tejnelti.
A line that I especially like in this poem, this beautiful poem, is mirrors for broken. And what I really like this poem is that it ties language to identity, which is basically what we're going to talk about in the following slides. For example, in the case of Spanish, two things can be true. Spanish was used as a tool of oppression in the Iberian Peninsula and Aviala. And I have here how Castilian took over in the peninsula and became the dominant language. But also Spanish is a subordinate language in the USA, and the speakers or descendants are racialized because of that connection. So the people that argue that, for example, language is just a decoding system, or is just grammar, or is just syntax, language is much more than that. Language, for example, a language spoken may be the reason a person is racialized, might be the reason a person is discriminated, might be the reason a person is oppressed. So I want us to think about that when we think about language. Now, why do I like when we speak about decolonization? Why do I think it's important to teach for proficiency? Because if we still teach for grammar, we sort of reduce language to a decoding system, and we sort of peel off all the cultural aspects and the identity aspects that language might have. So what happens when we start with using language instead of learning about language? That's a question that I want you to think about. So think for a minute about the focus of a unit you're teaching now, or that you are about to teach. If you tell me it's present tense, or if it's food, for example, how is that giving language the complexity that it has? How is that tying language to identity? How is that tying language to the sacredness that language has in the eyes of indigenous people? Now, when we teach for proficiency, for example, we might switch the center, instead of doing it about grammar or about a unit like food, family, we start thinking about what are my students going to explore and how are they going to explore it? And maybe we can find a question within that question, a question that can be the guidance for my students. So I'm not going to tell my students, you're going to learn about food, or you're going to learn present tense. I'm going to tell my students that we're going to learn about how is food, the food we eat, part of our culture. And I have, for example, 2 examples here of activities that I did with my students. When we learn of the importance of tamales in the Mexican community, and I have here a compare contrast of Guatemala celebrations and celebrations in Estados Unidos for Navidad, for Christmas. So when we switch, when we're planning a unit, when we switch from we're going to learn present tense to how are my students going to be using the language? What are my students going to explore? And what is the questions that my students get to answer in the exploration of these topics? It helps me plan in a way that doesn't deprive language of its identity aspect or its cultural aspect. So what is identity? Identity is the connected aspect of characteristics that define the person. That's one of the definitions. This is the Webster Dictionary definition. And we have the same here, the same wheel of intersectionality, because our languages are complex. I mean, our identities are complex. They are not simple. And when I told you, you need to bring your identity to the classroom in order to be on the same journey as your students, this is what I'm talking about. I have a little picture here, and this is how I started the school year, introducing myself with my pronouns to my students. I set the example. I share my gender identity with them through the using language as a vehicle, using language as a tool. I didn't say, today, children, we're going to learn about pronouns. I said, this is me, Françoise, she, ella. I'm using language as a way of talking about my identity. And I gave the tools to my students to use language to talk about their identities. So I'm not learning about pronouns as a grammar, as a grammar unit. I'm talking about pronouns as related to gender identity. Now, there's a quote by Audre Lorde that I liked, that it inspired the title of this webinar. It's not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize and accept and celebrate those differences. So how did I define identity for children? I taught K to 4th grade. I said, oh, identity is all the parts that make you who you are. And I picked the identity markers that would be easy to understand at that age and that level of comprehension. And I had race, ethnicity, physical abilities, gender expression, and then I have culture. I had an example there on the left, but I don't think we will have time to see that. We're going to save that for the workshop. It's a video where part of our identity journal was talking about our circles of care, circles of love instead of family. And I showed that video of diverse families where we spoke about how families and circles of care can look different. So one of the things that is super important when we start decolonizing our teaching of languages is to normalize diversity, is to present the speakers as can we save the questions for the end? Thank you. What it's really important is to normalize normalize diversity, normalize saying the groups of speakers of a certain language are a diaspora, because the problem that I see everywhere is that these umbrella terms like Latino, Latina, Latine, or Hispanic put a diaspora of people, a whole group of people that is as diverse as this quilt that is called Fabrics of Humanity, all together under an umbrella term, which makes us prone to stereotype and to paint the whole diaspora and the diaspora of dialects and accents in that group, in that community, and cultural differences with a broad brush. The problem with that too is when we don't decenter the ontological ideals. For example, in the textbooks, you see Spanish speakers and they are either mostly white, or there is an isolated unit of about a marginalized community, but it's very specific. And that causes otherness. Like today, we are gonna learn the story about this person, and it's basically trauma-centered. But when we see the diaspora as this beautiful quilt, we know that we need to include the stories and the cultures and the accents and the dialects of everyone in order to paint a more accurate picture of what the diaspora is. And then we have Rudim Sims Bishop, and I hope everybody has been exposed to this metaphor, which is mirror windows and sliding glass doors. I think I'm gonna save the video also for the workshop. What do you think, Kate? Do we have time for the video or maybe not?
We should probably try to wrap up so there's enough time for questions.
Okay, so I wanna just get to the end of this. Mirrors, windows, and sliding doors is a metaphor to talk about representation. Students from the global majority are the ones that need the biggest mirrors. And white students are the students that need the windows and sliding doors so they can see the world of the speakers of the diaspora. Like I said, these are the identity markers that I explore at elementary level, and creating a brave space in order for us to have these conversations and talk about these topics was very important to me. And in order to do that, I needed to acknowledge that I needed to create a brave space in my classroom, which is different to the safe space, because the safe space assumes that everybody comes with the same mindset to your classroom, when we actually have different voices and different mindsets coming to our classroom, and there is a potential for saying something that might hurt somebody or unintentionally causing harm. So when we talk about brave space, we hold each other accountable for those little mistakes, and we practice restoration. Things that you can do, projects that you can do to explore identity in your language classroom: identity journals, identity maps, for us and others, identity poems, video talks, photo talks, graphs analysis, and books that should be carefully chosen. For example, this is one of the graphs that I analyzed with my 3rd and 4th graders, where we talk about representation in books. And in order to plan these lessons, it is important to use a backward design. And what I guided myself with was the proficiency descriptors from ACTFL in order to know what my students can do with the language, so I can plan the lesson before doing that. Other standards that I use in order to plan my identity classes, my Spanish classes, was the standards, social justice standards from Learning for Justice. And for example, this is how a video talk will look like in 3rd and 4th grade novice Spanish class, where we talk about representation. This is a video about a transgender girl living in Texas, United States. Later on, after we watched the video, we did an identity map in order to talk about Adeline, which helped us see her identity in an intersectional way. Now we have a quick expectations checkup again. So how are you feeling about your personal path to decolonization after hearing this session? Do you have any questions? And do not forget, there is a workshop coming up on November 15, where we're gonna dig deep in these topics. And finally, because I had to finish with a meme, gracias totales. And now we open, I think, the mic for questions. Kate?
Thank you, Françoise.